Hello everybody, my name is Charl from Walt. I greet you from Cape Town, South Africa, where I'm based, but I work as the global head for security research at Orange Cyberdefense. Please take a moment to connect with me on Twitter. It would be great to hear from you online. So my presentation today is titled Winds of Change, and I want to use this short time that I have with you to share with you how we at Orange Cyberdefense go about trying to understand the cyber threat landscape, to make predictions about what's coming in the future, direct our efforts and help ourselves and our customers invest their scarce resources where it really makes the most difference. And the starting point for our work in this space is that we look at the cyber threat landscape a little bit like how you would look at climate and weather. We have the belief that just as the weather that we experience day to day, wherever you are, manifests because of fundamental underlying systemic factors that we call climate. In the same way, in cyber, the threats and the vulnerabilities and the breaches and exploits that we experience day to day actually come from a set of fundamental underlying systemic drivers. And what you see here is a depiction of the model that we use. Like any model, it has its boundaries and its weaknesses, but we find it useful as a way of organizing our thoughts around the threat landscape. And what we do is we start with what we call the root causes, those very deep initial drivers for why the cybersecurity problem emerges and why cybercrime and other forms of cyber threat emerge. We then believe that those fundamental drivers are catalyzed or accelerated by another set of factors, which gives them more energy and more force. As they accelerate, there are a set of enabling factors that basically act as impediments to our ability to counter them. So things that slow us down or get in the way. And then we have the shapers, which give that energy, that threat or vulnerability energy, a kind of a form or a direction. So ask yourself the question, why is cyber extortion or ransomware the particular cybercrime we're dealing with right now and not, online card skimming? So that's defined by the shapers. And then finally, we layer on top of that an understanding or a perception of the way that technology is evolving, because of course that threat energy then manifests in and around the technologies that we choose to deploy. Now, the useful thing about this model is that we can use it to understand where particular threats are coming from and therefore how we might go about countering those threats. So, and then we can compare them from threat to threat. So, for example, we can see that cyber extortion or ransomware is driven by a much deeper set of systemic factors, and that those factors are largely economic and socio-cultural. Whereas online card skimming has a much stronger technology element, and business email compromise has a very small technology element. And so by understanding the factors that drive a particular threat, we can understand how we're going to apply ourselves to countering that threat. We can also use the model to track signals, if you like, in the security landscape. And we do that by tagging different data sources that we have with references to these different systemic factors or the threats that we predict will emerge from those factors. And in this example, you see some of these threats that we've spoken about. We won't have time to discuss them all today, but I do want to draw your attention to the orange line, which shows that just recently, in the last couple of quarters, we've started observing something which we have predicted for a long time, but actually never did see. And that's the threat of attacks targeting mobile phones, specifically with the view to bypassing multi-factor authentication. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. What I want to do now, though, is to just give you an example of how this model applied can allow us to start making predictions about the future. Now, of course, like any model, our model isn't perfect and our predictions don't always come right, as we noted with the mobile phone threat. But at least by making concrete predictions against the model, we can learn about where we were right and where we were wrong. And I want to tell you a story that starts with one of the root causes, and it's a factor that we refer to as government offensive operations, and it really talks to the impact that government investment in computer hacking technology has on the overall landscape. Now, in the last quarter, we've observed a number of stories like this one that involve vulnerabilities and exploits targeting mobile phones and specifically Apple's iOS. And you'll note in this headline the term 0 day, which I'm sure you know refers to vulnerabilities that we are not yet aware of and don't yet have patches for. And it refers to NSO, which is the name of a commercial business that sells computer hacking technologies, particularly for mobile phones, to governments, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, military, and the like. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen NSO in the news. They've featured frequently or repeatedly in the security news over the last few years, particularly as their technologies impact the mobile phones of regular people who aren't necessarily being targeted, but whose technologies are found therefore to be vulnerable or may be accidentally exploited because of those technologies. Now, NSO emerges from an Israeli military capability called Unit 8200, which is their signal intelligence capability. And like many of these kinds of businesses, NSO found its skills, its experience, and maybe its understanding of the problem and the technology that addresses the problem in its origins as within the military. And of course, the technology is then sold back to the military and used by military intelligence and police, as I said. And that creates a kind of an unvirtuous cycle that we refer to as a cyber-military complex, where commercial businesses and governments kind of feed each other in this ongoing cycle. Now, one of the things that then drives is the industrialization of the development of computer security exploits. So what we see happening is that governments have a kind of national security driver for hacking technologies. It's either to, for sort of cyber conflict, or because they want to conduct espionage, or because they want to, investigate individual persons of interest. That creates then a professional class of computer hackers that emerge from governments and go into these commercial businesses. And that professional class, in turn, wants tooling and specifically wants exploits with which they can compromise phones and computers. And that demand by governments for exploits then creates or industrializes the market that develops these exploits, which often then don't come from within the cycle, but come from elsewhere, from outside. So to give an example of that, one of the businesses that develops or sources and sells these exploits is called Zerodium. They emerged originally out of France, I believe. And Zerodium brokers exploit development from the so-called private sector, or the black market, if you like, and sells them on to businesses like NSO and others, who then package those exploits up with the capabilities that they in turn sell to governments. And this market is highly lucrative. You can see on the right-hand side, if you look at the gray column, that Zerodium is offering $2.5 million for an effective exploit against a mobile phone. Now, that's a vast amount of money, particularly if you consider that this is what's being paid to the individual exploit developer. It's really the beginning of the sort of wholesale part of the supply chain. That exploit then gets bundled into tools which become more expensive, and those tools get bundled into capabilities which become more expensive. So we're talking about a lot of money. Now, the reason all of this is important to us becomes clear if we think back to the time in 2016 of the US elections and the conflict that emerged, in which the US government was accusing Russia of meddling in the US elections. And you'll recall at the time there were a lot of accusations flying up and down, and the US in particular was accusing Russia of various forms of cyber attack with the view of influencing the elections. And in the context of this war of words, of accusations and counter-accusations, there suddenly and unexpectedly emerged on the cyber threat landscape a new group of hackers who went by the name the Shadow Brokers. And the Shadow Brokers announced at that time that they had stolen or had somehow gained access to a cache of very sophisticated government hacking tools that had been developed and stolen from the US's National Security Agency, or NSA. And in a very sort of elaborate and theatrical event, the shadow brokers offered to sell and then eventually leaked out some of these NSA hacking capabilities. Now, those hacking capabilities or tools included two technologies, one called Eternal Blue and one called Double Pulsar, which you may remember for their role in what later became known as the WannaCry and then after that the NotPetya incidents, where those technologies were that had been leaked by shadow brokers onto the internet were baked into the virusware or the malware that was used, at least in part, in the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks. So what we see is a technology developed by one government being stolen and leaked by another government and then used by a third government to perpetrate a very significant cyber attack that affected all of us. And the takeaway from this is that this investment, this large volumes of money that drive the cyber military complex, don't stay isolated within the cyber military complex. They leak out because we all share the same internet and use the same technologies. And so there's a pattern that we observe and that we watch for very carefully, which is where you see a convergence between the drivers for cybercrime and the energy injected into the system by government investment into computer hacking. And that government investment has a kind of an inflationary or accelerating effect on the cybercrime landscape. And when that happens, you see a complete kind of inversion of the way we understand cybersecurity, and particularly the way we understand the economics of cybersecurity, because the money going into the development of these technologies and capabilities completely outmatches the kind of resources that your average kind of commercial business has with which to defend themselves. And what we need to note is that right now we're seeing a kind of a wave of that kind of investment affecting mobile phones and particularly affecting iOS phones. So that's an example of a factor that we track at the root causes level of our model. Another fact, at another level, which has got to do with the evolution of technology of our model, we track the role of passwords and authentication, multi-factor authentication, etc. And in this space recently, there's also been a very interesting development, which was the launch by Microsoft of their so-called Go Passwordless initiative, where Microsoft is undertaking to remove passwords as a form of authentication from all of their online and cloud systems. This is a fantastic security initiative which is long awaited for, and it makes perfect sense. Microsoft removes the password and moves authentication to the user's mobile phone via a much more secure authenticator app. And we imagine that other cloud providers, the Googles, the Amazons of this world, will soon follow suit, as will other identity service providers. Now, the third thing that we then, third level in our little story today involves the emerging threats. And one of the threats, as I mentioned early on, that we've been tracking for some time but haven't actually seen is attacks on mobile phones, specifically with a view to subverting multi-factor authentication or gaining access to or somehow doctoring those multi-factor apps that you get on your phones now. But as we see the move from passwords to fully passwordless authentication, what we anticipate will happen is that the mobile phone with its authenticator app will move front and center as part of the security perimeter, as that becomes the way with which people authenticate to their online systems. And if we then factor in the observation that coming out of the cyber military complex, we've seen more and more effort and resources being invested into compromising mobile phones, what we anticipate is a kind of convergence of those factors, where cyber criminals and other various actors will become more and more interested in compromising mobile phones, and the technology will then already exist as it leaks out of the cyber military complex, as we've seen that happening before. And the implications of this, of course, is that vulnerability management, patch management, monitoring, etc. on mobile phones will become a much higher priority for us than it has been in the past. So that's just an example of how our model can be used to tell a story about what's happening in the threat landscape at the moment and make predictions about what might happen in the future. And we're very proud of our model, and it's allowed us to gain a much richer understanding of the security landscape because of it. But in truth, there is also a fair amount of chaos that emerges from the convergence of these different factors. These factors themselves are all complex, and they interact in complex ways. And so what we find is that we're also pushed and tested and compelled to react to changes in the landscape in a very rapid and agile way. And in fact, because of this, we believe that agility, the ability to respond to new intelligence, also on a daily basis, not just into the future, becomes a really existential characteristic for any effective security operation. And to this end, within Orange Cyberdefense, what we're endeavoring to do is to adopt the so-called OODA paradigm, which speaks to observe, orient, decide, and act. And we've developed technologies, systems, and processes that allow us to drive intelligence through this loop in a way that very quickly results in decisions and actions being taken for our customers, and then feeds back into itself so that we can learn more about how the threat landscape works. Now, we call this security-led intelligence. It's not something that we sell as a business. It's something that underpins everything that we do when we interact with our customers. We look forward to talking to you about that more. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to taking some questions.